Many emerging writers spend an eternity pondering how to structure their stories. They know what they want to write about, but not how to structure or order it. I'm going to make that process as quick and easy as possible. There's really no need to overthink or overcomplicate it. Think about how you relate to stories. Most people know pretty early on when reading a book or watching a film whether or not they want to keep reading or watching. Now, a lot of this comes down to how the stories we are used to hearing and telling are structured. We are told stories pretty much from the time we're born, and we start telling them early on in our lives. By the time we start reading and writing, stories pretty much come naturally to us. We know they need to have conflict, as I've covered extensively before, but we also understand they have a particular structure. It's part of our DNA. We know that structure because we're so used to it. So ask a child about story structure and they'll almost inevitably say stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they're right. That's pretty much the order in which most stories are told. It's called a linear structure. Now, some stories are non-linear. They take the reader down various paths across different time frames and then lead the reader back onto the main road close to the end. Now, there's no right or wrong structure for a story, but there are two key factors to consider when determining your structure. The first of these is your audience. Are they the type of readers who are willing to go along for a sometimes bumpy ride and then trust that the author will get them to their destination? But perhaps more importantly, do you have the ability at this stage of your development as a writer to deviate from a pattern that is ingrained in people's mind from early on in their lives? Most stories that have a fractured or non-linear structure, at least those that work, are written by experienced writers who have written plenty of stories beforehand with a conventional structure. I mean, it's a case of that classic adage, you need to know the rules in order to break them. So my advice at this stage is to stick to a structure that you know and understand, and you do. And that allows you to concentrate on getting all the other aspects of your story spot on. And the structure that I recommend, you may have heard about, is the 3-act structure. Many writing teachers overcomplicate the 3-act structure, and there are many variants of it. I prefer to keep it as simple as possible. As you can see, the 3 parts of the 3-act structure are the setup, confrontation, and resolution. There are also 4 critical points which are marked with stars. I will look at these parts and points now. In the setup, you need to show your protagonist existing within their normal world. That way, the propulsion into the new world caused by the inciting incident will be more marked. The inciting incident occurs towards the end of Act 1, after the writer has introduced the protagonist in their normal world. Something happens that turns the protagonist's world upside down, and it has to be big enough that they cannot ignore it or turn back at any time. The second critical point is where the protagonist makes a decision to do something as a result of the inciting incident. What they can't do is not make a decision. Their decision ends the first act and takes them out of their normal world and into the conflict that is Act 2. The confrontation stage is the longest, and it involves the protagonist dealing with all sorts of conflict that stops them, at least for now, reaching their ultimate goal. Make sure you mix up the type of conflict, as well as including both big and small conflict. Most writers find the confrontation stage to be the hardest to write because the protagonist's goal has been established, but there is so far still to go before they confront the antagonistic forces in the climax. One way to keep readers enthralled throughout the confrontation stage is to introduce and explore subplots, particularly those involving the protagonist's romantic adventures or personal life and the personal lives of other characters. The third critical point is the moment where it looks impossible for the protagonist to get what they want. Now, not every story has this moment, but it is highly recommended. It's the point where the reader thinks, I cannot see any way this is going to end well. It's the point where James Bond is hung upside down and lowered into a tank of sharks. It's the point where the detective misses the vital clue that will put the criminal away for life. But the reader knows about the clue. How exasperating. Soon after the point of despair comes the climax, where the protagonist and the antagonistic force have a final battle, usually, though not always, resulting in the protagonist getting what they set out for. The antagonistic force does not need to be a traditional villain. It could be dark forces within the protagonist, or even a physical force. The resolution ties up loose ends, and most importantly, it shows the main character's reactions to events and how they have changed. Never introduce a new character in your resolution stage. 1. Download or print out 3-Act Structure 9. You'll find it on the website next to this lesson. If you have a story you are working on, write the relevant information for that story in the boxes. Do it in the following order. Act 1, Setup. Describe your protagonist's ordinary world. Inciting incident. Describe what happens to turn your protagonist's world upside down. Decision. As a result of the inciting incident, what does your character decide to do? In other words, what is their goal for the story? Then Act 2, Confrontation. Write down 10 bits of conflict that could stop your protagonists getting what they want, at least for a while. Before embarking on this part, try the exercise that follows called Snakes and Ladders. Point of Despair. Describe the situation where it appears that your protagonist has no hope of achieving their goal. Climax. Describe what happens at the point where the protagonist and the antagonistic force have their final battle, and note what the outcome is. Act 3, Resolution. Describe how the main characters react to the climax and how they have changed as a result, and how your protagonist has changed as a result of their struggles throughout the story. Note, if you do not have a story that you're working on, choose one of your favourite stories and complete each section based on that story. Then, when you do have a story in mind, you will already know how to do this exercise. This exercise will help you flesh out your second act. I referred to it in the last exercise. Now, I'm sure you've played Snakes and Ladders at some time. I want you to imagine this Snakes and Ladders board is your Act 2 confrontation. Square 1 is the beginning of the act, just after your inciting incident, and the decision your protagonist has made as a result of the inciting incident, which is your protagonist's goal. Square 100 is at the end of Act 2. It's the conclusion of the climax. This is where your protagonist has either achieved or not achieved their goal. There are 8 ladders on the board of various sizes. Make these ladders represent positive actions or decisions that your protagonist takes to get them closer to their goal. Write down a possible action or decision that you could include in your story for each ladder. The bigger the ladder, the bigger the action or decision. There are 8 snakes on the board of various sizes. Make these snakes represent obstacles that set your protagonist back in their overall goal. Write down a possible obstacle that you could include in your story for each snake. The bigger the snake, the bigger the obstacle. Think about the 3-act structure as the roadmap for your story. When you go on a road trip, you know where you're leaving from and usually where you're going. The more destinations you identify before you leave, the clearer and less stressful your trip's going to be. Writing a story is the same. The more you plan, the less likely it is that you will lose track and control of your story. Now, that doesn't mean you have to plan everything to a T. You don't. You can still be flexible. You can still experiment. Just as on a road trip, you may detour off the main road to see something off the beaten track, or decide to stay longer or shorter than anticipated at a particular point. But starting to write a long story without planning is akin to leaving home with no idea where you're going.